Welcome to the Well, Wild, and Free podcast, where the evidence-based meets the esoteric. I'm your host, Bria Hamlet. Join me and industry experts as we work through the 8 dimensions of wellness and truly uncover what it means to be holistically well, wild, and free. Let's dive in. Welcome everybody back to the Well, Wild, and Free podcast. As per usual, I'm your host, Bria. Today we have a super exciting guest, one of my favorite people to just talk to and learn from. Kyler Nathan IV is an author, a writer, a podcaster. He's from LA, and he is a creative and also a higher ed professional. So I really appreciate, again, people who wear both hats, especially with my own personal background in higher ed. But Kyler's goal is to amplify the stories of today, tomorrow, and really he believes that everybody has a compelling story to tell, as so long as you give them space and a platform to do it. So Kyler, thank you so much for being here.
Of course. Thank you for having me. I'm excited. This is my first time being a guest on a podcast. It's weird.
Yes, I'm so happy I'm honored to be the first. So this is going to be the first of many, especially because you've been in the podcast game for a while with your own podcast, the Banquet Hall podcast. Could you tell us just a little bit more about when you started that project, why you started that project, just to give folks a little bit more of an idea of who you are?
Yeah, of course. So the Banquet Hall is actually my third podcast that I've had the opportunity of recording. So my first podcast was Hoop Dreams, which was a Lakers focused podcast. Then I had Natural Nonsense with one of my best friends, Andre, where we talked about just how life is kind of mimics nature in a lot of different ways. And when you really start to look at the parallels, you can see a lot of nuance, a lot of creative ways you can start looking at life and nature. And so the Banquet Hall, it started in November of last year, November 2022. And the reason I started this podcast, one, I wanted a new creative endeavor where I was the solo host of the podcast. I wanted to kind of operate on my own time, not have to rely on other people to schedule recording times, just really my own thing that I have complete control over. And so I was having a conversation with one of my close friends, Ariosella, about wanting to interview people that I was in close contact with, just because I felt like I knew so many different people doing cool things. And those people were trying very hard to get their name out there, to go viral, to just get the support that they needed. But it wasn't happening organically, I would say. And then on the flip side of that, I could turn on social media at any time during that period, and I could see what Kanye West was up to. I could see what was up with Taylor Swift, Beyonce. And it's like, I like the celebrity culture. I'm from LA, like it's Hollywood, yada, yada. But at the same time, there's so much more, not necessarily more compelling stories, but a lot more close to home stories that I feel you don't get to see the most attention of on social media. And so I created the Banquet Hall as an avenue to highlight what I say, the stories of tomorrow today, just because I know these are people who are going to get to the destination they want to go to. And I don't think we need to wait till they get to that destination to hear the stories about how they got there. And so going back to the conversation with Ariosella, she was mentioning that she heard a quote about how people of color, BIPOC folks, we're tired of looking for a seat at the table, and we need to instead build our own banquet hall. And the Banquet Hall was born.
I love that. And also, I love the intention with the wording. The ADHD in me totally just flipped those words around. And now that I'm reading it, I'm like, oh, the stories of tomorrow, today. Like, that's so smart and intentional. So thank you for that.
Of course.
Yeah, and I wholeheartedly agree. I feel like there are so many dope people in any city, in any given space, and we just don't hear each other's stories because, again, we're not dominating the algorithm. And, you know, sometimes it makes me mourn the days where, like, you could get on Instagram and actually see things in chronological order and, like, actually see your friends versus,
Right.
like, I'm seeing posts from a page I don't follow because they're like, you liked one post. I'm like, can I see my friend's post that I actually follow?
Right.
Like, why? So I think that just the concept is solid, and you're absolutely right. Like, we all have the capacity to grow and be seen, and a lot of times we just aren't creating space for each other. So it's really, really cool that you're doing that. And I think that's definitely in line with the conversation that we're going to be having today. So before we dive deep into that, just to learn a little bit more about you, without telling us exactly what you do, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, and I really appreciate this question because I feel like so often, especially in the society we live in, people go to like, oh, well, this is my 9 to 5 job. This is what I do on the side. So really had to think a little bit about this one. But I think the one thing I always start with is I'm from Los Angeles, the city of angels. My hometown is very important for me, as you can see from my background, my Kobe jersey. We're recording this on Kobe's birthday.
Oh,
Uh, yeah, I know, right? It was something special in the atmosphere. But being from LA is very important to me, just because I feel like when we talk about the city of Los Angeles, too often we talk about Hollywood or Santa Monica, like these very like glitz and glamour, the celebrity lifestyle of LA. But being from the like city of Los Angeles and like the people that I was around, all the different cultures that I'm around, the different food I have access to, it's just there's a lot of LA pride within me. And I feel like I get a lot of my kind of laid back personality from being from LA too. Like you have the laid back side, but also the go getter mentality. And one of the things that's really important for me as I continue to grow and blossom is to tell the story of where I'm from. Like I didn't grow up in Hollywood. I didn't grow up in like Rancho Palos Verdes, but I grew up like near the Inglewood area. Like it wasn't the best neighborhood, nor was it the worst neighborhood. But when I tell people I'm from LA, I really want them to know, like, nah, like I'm from the city where the people are. And so I always like starting with being from LA because that's just so important to me. I tell people I'm a Lakers fan. You see the flag in the background. I'm a very family oriented person. Family community is very important to me, just because I feel like J. Cole has as far as like what good is first class if my people can't sit. Like it's like
hey,
why am I
yeah.
doing all of this if like I'm not with the people that helped me get here? And so I'm a very family oriented person. Will always go out of my way to do stuff for family, do stuff for friends. I'm a cinephile. Like I love movies. I'm obsessed with watching movies, especially over the last few years. Once the pandemic hit, I started watching a lot of movies that I loved and started really thinking about why I love these movies. And so recently, I've started watching like movies from the '80s and the '90s, classics that people really love, and just really understanding why people want to watch certain films. I've been really interested in writing my own film one day. So cinephile is really big part of my identity right now. I love nature. I love being by the water. Anytime I'm by the ocean is just pure bliss for me. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that later. And then the last thing I'll say about me is I'm a nerd. I love superheroes. You can see part of the Funko Pop collection in the
Hey,
background.
yes, I love
Um,
it.
I I just love nerddom. Like I love the things that people nerd out onto. Like whether you're super passionate about Pokemon, Dragon Ball Z, Barbie, whatever it is, I just like when people nerd out about the things that they're passionate about. So being a nerd is a big part of my identity as well. So I think that's kind of a multifaceted look at who I am without talking about what I do.
So I just want to say, like, you remind me so much of my brother, and I'm like, why do I vibe with Kyler? And I'm like, oh, because you remind me of Eric. Eric is also super, super, super into movies. He has a podcast called The Good Scare, and he reviews
Mm.
horror movies. Eric, I'm like doing your own like elevator speech for
I
you,
was about to
but
say I'm adding it to the list of podcasts I'm gonna start listening to.
yes, definitely. And he also is a screenwriter and records like film. So for sure, if there are things you're interested in, I'm sure y'all can connect. And also, like, we're a big family of we're just nerdy people. Like the thing that is so funny, I think about my younger sister. I have two siblings, my brother and my sister, and my brother and I are definitely like to the core nerds. My sister, she sometimes she's just like, I don't know what happened with me. Like I'm just like normal, and she got two nerdy older siblings. But I love it, and I think there's so much joy being able to just like be yourself. I think that's really what it speaks to, and what I appreciate about like nerddom is that there's no care about what it is that you're interested in. You're like, I'm interested in this for me, like period.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it brings me joy, and I wish more people could experience that, because I think that's part of the issue we have right now, and actually that ties really well into what we're going to be talking about today, which is social well-being. Social well-being is, or at least I have defined it as, having healthy relationships with friends, family, and the community. Being socially well could also mean caring for the needs of others and really mankind in general. And a lot of times, social well-being can be impacted by whether or not you feel respected or received
Mm.
or appreciated. But before we go down into the rabbit hole with that, I would love to know, how would you define well-being?
How would I define well-being? I would say that for me, well-being is like a ongoing process of checking in with yourself holistically, so physically, mentally, spiritually. I feel like well-being is just about that ongoing process of finding some type of healthy balance in a general sense, whether it's making sure that your spiritual well-being isn't being neglected for your physical well-being, etc. Making sure that the things that you're doing to sustain your lifestyle aren't taken away from your mental health. But I think the big emphasis for me is just that it's an ongoing process, because there's going to be days where you're feeling really well mentally or physically, and there's going to be days where there's a little bit more nuance and balance there. So I think that's kind of how I generally look about it, and it's just a process of trying to get better at it. I think that's why I just really emphasize the ongoingness of well-being, because yeah, it's just something you work on. We learn more, we grow more, we figure out things that are more beneficial or detrimental to our mental health, physical health, spiritual health. And so it's just an ongoing process of figuring that out for me.
Yeah, I love that. And it really is. I mean, every given day is an opportunity to improve your well-being. It's also going to present things that could negatively impact your well-being in any of those dimensions, like you spoke to. It's like you might be physically feeling well, but financially things are a little sketch, or like, there's just so many things that could go awry. And it's just the like constant pursuit of balancing those things. And knowing that at any given time, nothing's going to be all the way 100% solid, but doing what you can. It really is a lifestyle, which that word I have such a like weird relationship to, because I feel like you hear wellness lifestyle and you immediately think like green juice and yoga. And I'm like, like, no, like those could definitely be a part of it, but it's really, truly way bigger than that, which is essentially the point of this podcast anyway. So thank you for sharing that. And in that same vein, growing up, you mentioned Inglewood, you mentioned LA. What was your relationship to health and wellness like when you were growing up?
It's a good question. I feel like I didn't necessarily have a relationship to it per se. I feel like it was just something that, you're supposed to eat your 5 fruits and veggies a day. You're supposed to drink water. You're supposed to get exercise. Like people just kind of talked about it. It's like, yeah, this is very task oriented, like relationship with wellness. It's like, okay, did you drink water today? Did you eat? Did you get exercise? I don't think that growing up, we talked a lot about any wellness outside of physically. Like, I don't think there was a big conversation about mental health. Spiritual health, I think, depending on how you're looking at it, like going to church is probably the spiritual wellness and well-being. But yeah, I think it was really just focused in task oriented. It was focused in making sure that you're eating well, having a sustained weight. But I never really thought too much about other aspects of health, or whether or not that relationship was even healthy. Like, was I just trying to eat fruits and veggies because people kept telling me to eat fruits and veggies, or did I really think that it was doing something for me? So yeah, I don't think I really developed too much relationship growing up until probably even getting to like college, when I started to learn a lot more about just the different facets of wellness, I would say.
Mm. I appreciate your transparency in that, like, yeah, it is often this checklist of these are the things you can do to stay healthy. It's that same thing that we all got, especially for like, depending on when you were born, but for many of us who are like, 90s kids or early 2000s kids, you've got this like turn of the century sort of like, uh, like food pyramid, and like go out, play outside. And, there wasn't really like a why. And maybe, it was our age, but even when I think about the generations before us, and I do understand the privilege in this, right? Because we went from survival mode, we're still in survival mode, but we went from like serious, intense survival mode to like, oh, what would it be like to thrive? Like, I don't really know what that means and looks like. And so I'm not going to spend time. And also, like, there's a lot of time and energy that goes into even investing in your well-being, especially if you're going to do it holistically. So, it makes sense. And hopefully that culture will continue to evolve. And speaking about culture, so we're going to dip into our data corner over here. I'm going to give you some statistics around, really around media and literature. You've spoken a lot about your love of film, I know that you're also a poet. And so when it comes to storytelling, I felt like these might be some compelling things. So here's the first one. Due to persistent racial inequities, fewer Black-led stories get told. And when they are, these projects have been consistently underfunded and undervalued, despite often earning higher relative returns than other properties. And this is from a 2021 article from McKinsey & Co. So what are your initial just thoughts in hearing that?
Not surprised. I think that it's just the world that we live in. Representation is something that I feel, depending on what spaces you're in, as we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, both coming from higher ed backgrounds, I feel like a lot of our environment was kind of centered towards representation. But when you step outside of those environments, sometimes representation isn't talked about in the same type of respect as you might get on a college campus. But even thinking about the movies that we see and what movies are talked about, what movies have the most publicity in the theaters, right? Like within this last like month and a half time span, there's actually been like a few stories centered around Black individuals, but whether it's because of the strikes going on and the inability of some of these studios to publicize the movies as they would have, but even just you look at the social media conversations, everyone's talking about Barbie, everyone's talking about Oppenheimer. They have the Haunted Mansion remake with Lakeith Stanfield starring in it. Talk to Me is starring a Black woman. There's another one about like I think like male strippers in Vegas that has some Black leads in it. They Clone Tyrone is something that's on Netflix right now, and
So
I
good.
feel like if you, it is really good, but I feel like if you're not talking to Black people about these things, they're not getting a lot of the publicity that other projects might be getting. And yeah,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's due to funding, whether it's due to quote unquote lack of interest, I think that's another thing that people will throw out there because we aren't part of this dominant culture of people. It's just like, oh, well, people aren't interested in those stories or these stories aren't doing that well, when realistically, there's so many different barriers that prevent these stories from getting the shine that they see because maybe this Black centric story, they had a crowdsourcing to get their film made. Maybe they had to
Mm-hmm.
do like a GoFundMe or a Kickstarter campaign to get that film made, and they didn't have enough money to publicize it as much as they might need
Right.
to. They don't have access to those resources. They don't have connections to people in these high positions. So yeah, I definitely don't think it surprises me at all. I would like for that statistic to be different, of course, which is why the Banquet Hall exists and why I like being a podcaster, just to try to get those stories out there. But even that's an uphill battle trying to get listenership because you need to fit a certain mold to get your stories out there, to get to the target areas that you want to reach. So it's an upsetting statistic, but not a surprising one.
Yeah. I feel like that's a common theme. Like, I'm disappointed to hear this, but also I am not in the least bit surprised. And even that part about, the relative returns are higher because we, especially as Black folks, but I know marginalized folks of all communities do this. When we are represented in something, we rally around it. We're like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
like even the other day I went and saw Barbie with my partner and she was like, I'm not super interested in watching this movie, but Issa Rae is playing the president, therefore I'm going to go
Yep.
watch this movie. And I was just like, sure, yeah, that tracks. And of course, and it actually ended up being, I really was happy as someone who did really love Barbie growing up. But I digress. We really are our own like best marketing tool when it comes to being a marginalized person. And I also wonder, and this, kind of flow of media, what it does for our well-being to see us or see other people who are typically not represented doing things other than fighting their way through slavery in a movie. I I specifically have not watched anything that is. I think with the last one was maybe Django, but like I have really tried to avoid watching movies that center Blackness in a way that is so painful and traumatizing every single time we watch it. And then I'm like, can we do something else? That's why like even seeing Issa play President Barbie, I'm like, cool, like that makes me happy and brings me some joy, and I know it's gonna inspire some little girl. And I just I'm glad to see the tide has changed, but now that the tide has changed, trauma sells. So since trauma isn't selling, then people are like, oh, we don't care. We're not going to prioritize funding that. It's wild, wild
It
for
is
sure.
wild. I think that the movie for me is Fruitvale Station. Like I'll probably never watch that movie.
I haven't
Um,
seen it either. Yeah.
yeah, and if I could say this really quickly, I think that's one of the reasons why I'm very interested in screenwriting and creating
Mm,
movies because I want to tell stories of just like, for lack of a better term, like regular Black people. Like, what is life like for Black college students just on a campus where the goal of the movie isn't to just, oh, this racist thing happened on campus or
right.
it sucks here, but like, where are the Black people having fun on campus? Where's the D9 on campus? Like, what are Black people our age just doing that we could just have a movie about? Because when you look at some of the most popular like comedies or coming of age stories, like from the 80s, from the 90s, like movies like The Breakfast Club and stuff like that, where it's like, yeah, you'd be lucky to see Black people in those movies, but it's just telling a story of just like regular human beings living their lives. And I want to write I want to write an original Black superhero movie, like not one that
Yes.
has
Yeah.
already existed, but also just telling those regular coming of age stories. Like, no, these are actual people that I grew up with, because non-Black folks, non-BIPOC folks, they've had these movies, they've had these stories in the media for so long. And I want our youth to be able to start growing up with stories where it's like, yeah, you don't have to be the next civil rights leader in this movie. You could just be a guy who wants to be a firefighter. Like, if that's what
Yes.
you want to do.
Yes. Yes. There's something about like the mundane. There's so much
Mm-hmm.
joy in being able to have a mundane experience. So yeah, I definitely, I would love to see that. Please, please create the movie, and
I
then
got
cast
you.
a random person as a random Black guy as a firefighter. Okay, so one more stat. So per a 2021 Nielsen News report, as Black Americans continue to video stream, listen to radio and podcasts, as well as buy Black, they continue to lead the conversation and stay connected through social media, having an unprecedented impact on brands and what consumers watch, purchase, and listen to. How does that land for you?
It's complicated. Just because I feel like when we're in the social media age, I feel like there's always conversations about how like Black Twitter runs, like kind of the social consciousness, like the zeitgeist. It's
Mm-hmm.
like whatever Black people are thinking is cool in the moment, people are taking and running with it. And there's Black creators, like TikTok had this big thing early on, and it's still an issue where it's like the Black creators who are creating these dances, creating these trends, they're not going viral. But when it's just your standard white girl doing the dance, and they have 1 million views on TikTok. And I think that statistic or that really hits home is just because some folks that I know who will be listening to this podcast know I just finished my MBA
Oh,
last December.
congrats! Yeah.
Thank you. But a lot of the things that we're talking about in terms of marketing and strategies, it's like I start to see kind of the gears of the machine that we're in, like just having the MBA now and learning how all of this works. And I'm like, damn, like y'all really just like send your marketing people to Black Twitter, see what Black Twitter is talking about. And it's like, oh, we need to get on this, or this is the new slang that we need to use in these things. These are the things that are cool now. Like Black people have historically like spearheaded the culture. Like we
Mm-hmm.
are the culture, whether it's how we dress, the music that we're doing. Um, yeah. So the reason I say complex is just because it's like, yes, Black people are creative, beautiful individuals, and we should be spearheading a lot of the culture. But I just wish that Black people, BIPOC folks, we saw more of the benefits of that and were able
Mm-hmm.
to get equitably compensated for these things, or even just being in those rooms, like being at the table, for lack of a better word, because maybe you did see somebody go viral for doing this cool dance, but are you consulting them on putting them in Fortnite? Are you consulting
Right.
them on including them in these movies? Like those are the types of things that makes it very complex, because yeah, I just feel like in the business world behind the curtains, it's like they know what they're doing. They know where they're getting this information from. They know what is happening and how it's part of a bigger picture. And it's just, yeah, it's frustrating sometimes, but also it gives me like just motivation to keep doing what I'm doing and being in my lane, because there's so much creativity out there. There's so many stories out there that we need to tell. But yeah, Black people are just continue to drive the culture forward.
Yeah. Yeah. We are leaders and change makers, and you're right. It is not lucrative for the companies to go back and consult with the person who started the idea, because they can get away with just taking it and running with it, and it happens all the time. It is, truly indicative of the culture that we live in. And, on top of that, again, I think about the impact long term to like our emotional well being of, feeling like we have these rich ideas and we bond over something and it's great. And then all of a sudden it gets co opted and sold back to us. I feel like Juneteenth is a really huge example of that, and the way that like we got this holiday finally, which is one of those that's even complex in and of itself, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, we get a paid day off for it. Like, now what? Because the number of people who I heard were like, I have a day off today, but I don't really know why I have the day off. And I'm like, you won't even say the word. Like, that is wild to me. Like, okay, so, but again, there's no education and all this other things. Meanwhile, there are folks who have, religious observances that we still as a country won't acknowledge either. And so there's just,
Yeah.
again, when you talk about like capitalism and Black ideas and wanting Black folks to make money, and then also understanding we have to work inside of this machine, the toll that it takes. I mean, to also feel like I've struggled with it too, with brand collaborations is like knowing that I am probably the only Black creator they're working with, or I'm one of few. And, I definitely, you just made me have a recovered memory of 2020 when a brand I was working with hadn't posted a Black person on their Instagram feed for, I don't think ever. And
Wow.
within the week of us losing George Floyd, my face immediately appears on the feed. And I was just like, y'all have had these pictures for 2 years and have done nothing with them. And now, and then of course, thank goodness, one of my other good friends, Tiara, blew the whistle and was like, what are y'all doing? I saw that. I scrolled back just to verify. No. And it became this huge, they had a whole conversation, back when we were having all those round tables and all those pass the mic moments. And,
when 2020, when everybody discovered racism for
right.
the first time.
Exactly. Everybody discovered it. But it does suck because we make so many other people money. And when we talk about like the wealth gap that we still see, how that impacts our ability to be healthy and well in the long run, not to mention the fact that we already know, at least on the public health side, we know that making more money is not protective for Black folks. It actually does not improve your health outcomes. It's really depressing. If you're just hearing that for the first time, I'm so sorry. It can prolong your life in other ways. You could probably have better access to certain types of healthcare, or your basic needs are being met. But as far as like your ability for your body to just withstand the stress of racism, like money does not improve that.
Nope.
And so it kind of goes back to it's like the full circle thing of like, we create because it brings us joy, but it would be nice to make money off of that instead of somebody else cultivating it with their money and then selling it back to us. And then we're like, oh yeah, I'm going to go buy that Juneteenth pillow from Walmart. It's like, or you could buy it from the Black creator on Etsy who's, but then convenience, and it's just a vicious ass cycle. A stressful
machine.
Yeah.
It's so stressful.
Oh my gosh. So in that thought, when we think about like taking care of ourselves, taking care of our community, in public health, we have frameworks. I love frameworks. And one of my favorite frameworks is called the social ecological model. And it basically outlines different levels or opportunities to influence the health and well-being of someone. So it goes like this. Individual is like the smallest little circle on the inside. And then outside of that is the interpersonal ring. So think like your friendships, your family. Then you have the institutional ring. So the, our workplace, organizations you frequent. Then you have the community. So that might be your city, state, county, etc. And then you have public policy. And so I bring this up because when I think about your podcast and what you've been doing, it feels a lot like you're caring for your community. It feels like community care, which is a term that that I like to use. A lot of people like to reference. And basically it's this idea that we're using our knowledge, our resources, our privileges to support each other. And I will link a great article on community care in the show notes for folks who want to learn more about it. But because the Banquet Hall is designed to highlight future leaders, influencers, entrepreneurs, do you feel like your work is community care? Do you see that lens?
That's a great question. In retrospect, yes, I honestly didn't think about it that way until you asked me to be on this podcast. I was like, I guess it is kind of community care. And I think that just goes back to just like speaking different languages. Like, I think if I had the language of community care, like earlier on, I might have seen it more as community care. But as I reflect on the question, I'm like, yeah, like it is community care. But I think when I first started doing it, I was looking at it as care for community. Like, I just care for community, so I'm doing this, but didn't really reflect back on that being like community care, even though it's right in the way I say it. But I think, yeah, just the rationale behind wanting to do it, wanting to connect different networks of people, having different networks feed into each other. Because the reason why I wanted to focus on interviewing people was because maybe I interview you on the podcast and your brother listens to it and your friends listen to it. But then maybe they decide, oh, let me see what other episodes are here. And then they find Jada doing Black beauty near you. And they're like, oh, like I needed Black hair care products. Let me check this person out. Because like you said, one of the things that prevents us from really feeding into Black businesses is the convenience factor of, oh, I could just go to Walmart, or I know Target has this.
Yep.
So I saw the Banquet Hall as a way to connect people to where it's like, hey, maybe you didn't know that there was any Black financial people that you might have access to, but now you know that Kyler's friend Jada has Green Line Planner, and you can go to Green Line Planner if you need to do that. And just hoping that the different communities I'm interviewing feed into other aspects of the podcast. And I think just even helping people to amplify their stories is a form of care. There's been countless times in interviewing people on the podcast where I'll ask a question or follow up on something, and the response is like, "Oh, I've never been asked that before. I've never really had space to talk about this before." One of my favorite stories recently, I just interviewed my friend Irene, who has a blog called Ren Speaks. And at the beginning of the podcast, as we were talking about where she's from, she mentioned that most of her family's in Ghana and that she met her grandparents for the first time when she visited Ghana for the first time. And I was like, wow, like I can't even imagine what it's like to meet your grandparents for the first time, like as whatever age you are. And so she told that story, and she said that's a story she hasn't told in like several years. And just being able to care about community enough to know that that's an important story to tell, I think that's where the community care happens, because especially I've seen it in my own life with like some of the elders in my life. There's so many stories that no one's asking them to tell, or nobody's like really giving them space to talk about. So I really cherish when I, even if it's only 10 minutes, like, no, like we have time. Like, let's talk about it real quick. Like why is this story important to you? Like, what did this mean for you? Because that's where you really start to unpack just what people have been through, what people have worked so hard on. One of my friends, we talked about how she's been doing so much to prepare to be a poet. And it's like, yeah, when you really unpack it, you might have spent that 10,000 hours that they say to master something if you really start to unpack all that you've done. So, yeah, just caring for people's stories, caring to give people a platform to tell their stories. I definitely see it as a form of community care, because everyone needs support to get to where they want to be. So even if I'm only giving them 2 extra people that listen to their song or 2 extra people that buy their product, that's 2 more than they have. That's how I look at it.
Oh, that's so dope. That's so rich in so many ways, because those 2 people, you have no idea who those 2 people could be. 2 can turn into 200 very quickly, and so on. And also just the fact that like our stories, especially as marginalized folks, are typically left out of the books. Like they were straight up written out of many, many books. And then, moving forward, we have this sort of digital record of what we're doing, but you get great stories. I know I get great stories whenever I ask my grandmother a random question, and I'm just like, why haven't you ever told me this? She's like, I don't know. I've never thought about it, or like never thought to talk about it. And so,
Right.
The fact that you're getting ahead of the 8 ball, that's really cool and healing. It's like, what do you don't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been, kind of a thing. And I also think just knowing, like, so listeners, Kyler and I worked together at a certain university, and we were one of few, very, 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 very few Black professionals on that campus. And that campus also, unfortunately, has a really rich history in a really shitty way when it comes to Black folks. And it's so much so that a whole movie has been, and TV series was written about it. And so when I think about like stories and community, I share that because when I stepped on campus, I did not know that said movie that I had just watched, so not too long before, was based off of the campus I was coming to work for. And it took a Black staff person randomly reaching out to me and saying, hey, I saw you're new here. You want to get lunch? I'm like, sure. And sat down, and she told me, and I was just like, how would I have known this if someone didn't just pull me aside? Because it was kind of, I eventually would have figured it out because I went to the resource center and been like, what is happening? But the care that she took to make me aware as soon as possible, so that I could be, guarded, but also aware in that space, that was a very like caring and loving thing. I realized that it was really like an act of love, even though it kind of burst that little bubble I had for like the first 2 days of being on campus. Like, this is great. And I was like, oh God, what have I done? But, I think being in that space where we're serving, young minds, when you work in higher ed and you're thinking about, it's so much of that work is community work, period. It doesn't matter what you're doing on a college campus, you're working in community. And so it tracks that you see the larger, thing about these stories, stories you would probably hear from students too. And like, wow, this is so like interesting and compelling. So yeah, I'm sure you might have thoughts about all of that, but yeah.
Yeah, I think the student piece is a big thing that I feel fueled a lot of wanting to do the banquet hall also, because I was working with students, Black students, every single day. Like they were under me as a like de facto supervisor or just in the space I was working in, and just hearing what they're passionate about or what they're interested in. And I would even date that even further back to when I was an admissions counselor and got to talk to prospective
Hmm.
students, and they would come to the table and are like, man, I really want to do this, but I have no idea how to get there. That's essentially what every conversation was like. Or on the flip side of that, they were pursuing their parents' dream of what they wanted them to be, but they
Hmm.
had a completely different vision in mind. If I could tell a very abbreviated story really quickly, I used to recruit in Athens. Well, I recruited across Georgia, mainly in Atlanta, but I got to go to Athens, Georgia, which is about an hour east of Atlanta. And it's much more of a conservative neighborhood, a conservative town. And so I was at this college fair, and we had this brochure that talks about community on campus and talks about like resources for LGBTQ folks, marginalized communities. And she came to the table and she was like, "Oh, like, can I take this?" I was like, "Oh yeah, like of course." And I started talking to her about the different resource centers, and she was like, "Yeah, like I'm gonna hide this." I was like, "Oh, like why? Why do you need to
Hmm.
hide it?" She's like, "Oh, my parents don't want me to come to California." I was like, "Oh, because it's too far," and it's like, "No, too liberal." And I was like, "Damn, like
Wow.
just the fact that she wasn't able to fully like even express interest in a place that she wants to go to because of her parents' ideals or the
Hmm.
way that she was raised, and just having so many of those stories where it's like, oh, I've literally had students come up to the table, it's like, oh, I'm so passionate about dance, I really want to be a dancer, like that's what brings me the most joy. Can you talk to me about y'all biology major? And
What?
I'm like,
You just said?
we just had this conversation about dance. Like, we have a really good dance program too. That's like, yeah, but my parents want me to study biology. And I'm
Mm.
like, ugh, like there's this part of me that's like, I need to answer your question, and like I
Hmm.
want to respect whatever family dynamics y'all have. Your parent might be right there. Like, let me talk to you about this. But I always would throw in there, like, but just so you know, you could do it this way too.
Yeah.
Like that was kind of my MO as an admissions counselor. It's like, I'll give you the answer you want to get, but if you like, because I hate when people are like, oh well, you can't make money doing that. Like,
Hmm.
let's talk about how you can though. Like, let's stop talking about why you can't make money doing that.
Yeah.
So yeah, just hearing those stories, answering questions, like seeing who people want to be, I'm like, yeah, like maybe you're not there yet, but this story is still compelling to tell. Like, I want to hear the story about how like you had to help raise your siblings, and your parents saved up so you can go to college and become this doctor. Like, that's just as compelling as, oh, I'm already a doctor and this is what I do on a day to day.
Hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And it does, the thing about community and people showing up as their authentic selves is that you inspire someone else to show up as their authentic self. Like, it's that one of my favorite quotations of all time is, a candle loses nothing by lighting another candle. And forgive me for not remembering who
Mm.
said that first, but if I can find it, I'll put it in the show notes. It's so important to me to just like show up and glow, create space, light up the world. And then people might be like, you know what? I thought I wanted to be a doctor, but I realized that was my parents' dream. And there's probably some ancestral trauma with that. There's some attachment to wealth and the pursuit of wealth, the pursuit of stability. There's a whole lot that goes into that. But also, like, what would it mean to explore this artist route and to break that pattern? Because that's essentially what it is we're breaking the pattern of scarcity
Mm-hmm.
and fear, and we're breathing life into our stories. And I think, when you work in the collegiate space, you get to, again, have those like really fresh minds, but also people who, for the first time, are starting to really think about, well, what is it that I like to do? And they evolve. I evolved. I changed my major when I was in undergrad. I think a lot of people go through that. I thought I wanted to be a doctor because I love health. I still love health, but I realized I didn't have to be a medical doctor to do it. Um, so I think it's really cool that you have that experience, because again, it informs the way that you are able to hold space for other people telling stories. Because we hear a lot when you work with college students, you hear a lot of things behind closed doors, and you're just like, wow, why have you shared that with someone? Like,
Yeah.
how compelling. And it's better than half of what we see on TV these days anyway. So
Say
it's just
that.
like, there's so much richness and opportunity out there. Thinking about community, what role do you think community plays in your ability to be your healthiest, happiest self?
It's essential. I think that it's just so essential for me to see people who I relate to, who look like me, thriving in whatever they need to thrive in. I think that that's what made the pandemic such a challenging thing to go through and continue to go through, because especially at the onset of that, you were really cut off and isolated from different communities. And that came from a place of community care too, where it's like, yeah, I could theoretically just go to my grandma's house or go to a friend's house, but what risk am I bringing to their lives and to their health by
Mm.
uh, interacting with them when we don't know what this virus is doing? And I feel like that's when I really started to see just how important community was in ways that you don't even really notice. Like during the pandemic, there was days, weeks where I might only say hi to one or two people, like in real life. Like I'm not hugging as many people as I might hug. I'm not seeing people just passing by. I'm not hearing just laughs from people around me. And so I think that community is so essential in that sense, but also just to help push me to be thorough and consistent in what I'm doing as well. Because if I'm seeing the people I'm surrounded by, whether it's, oh, I really want to be a rapper, and I'm seeing them put out these songs, or I'm seeing them publicize music videos that they've been in, it's like cool, because if I see other people doing it, I'm like, okay, like even when times get hard, like I can do this too. Like I can lean on people in community. We can support each other. Um, yeah, I just get such a drive from being around people, even though I am an introverted person. Like I don't want to be like socially around people all the time, but I like to hear people's thoughts. I like to hear what they're passionate about. I like to hear what they're creatively pursuing. And I think that's all essential in terms of community. Like I'm definitely a serial empath too. Like I
Mm.
love to just talk to people, relate to people, hear what they're going through, see where we can find things that we relate in. And I feel like those are the things that fuel me, keep me going. Even in a working space, like that's why I loved working directly with students, because you're seeing their community being built, you're seeing them grow as people. You're mirroring what they're going through or where they're at their stage of their collegiate career to where you might have been at your collegiate career,
Hmm.
comparing how far along they are, things that they're having questions about or pursuing, and being able to help people along the way. Like I think lifting as we climb is kind of probably the central thesis to that, because I would love, like I mentioned earlier, like I would love to get to the top of the mountain by myself, but for what?
Yeah.
Like why am I up here all by myself when there's people down there who I could have helped along the way, and we could have got up here together? Because even if we don't reach the peak of the mountain, if we're at like the third highest peak of the mountain, but we're with everybody and everybody's having a good time, like that's what matters to me. That's what's important to me. So yeah, community is definitely essential to being my best self, because I don't feel like I can comfortably say that like I'm in a healthy state of mind or a healthy spiritual state of mind if I know that I haven't checked in with my community, or if the community isn't a part of that journey.
Mm-hmm. So, so true. Like, we could all eat. We could all eat. And this idea, like, to me, it comes from, it's almost like the opposite of the crabs in the barrel mentality of like, there is no joy in being up there by yourself. It's like, what's the point if one of us is liberated and the rest of us are suffering? You're gonna be alone, and we all know that human beings cannot thrive alone. We need each other. We need people, and I would much rather be on the third tier, but all my homies are here, all my family's here, versus being up there by myself. And it's just like, well, this sucks. That doesn't solve the majority of your problems. So I'm really, really here for that, and I love to see that it plays such an integral part in your life. I think it plays more than we realize a role in all of our lives, even if you are an introvert. You know, and that might be a Taurus thing. We're both Taurus suns, and I'm like, I love to like observe people, and I'm just like, I'm rooting for you, even if I'm like
Mm-hmm.
in my own bubble and you have not heard from me in a long time. I'm like, I'm rooting for you, though, I promise. Um,
Exactly.
so yeah, love that, love that. All right, so we have made it to our last couple of questions. Got to round it out, of course, coming back to the theme of well, wild, and free. Kyler, what keeps you well these days? What's keeping you healthy physically and mentally?
What's keeping me well these days? One, I think it's podcasting. Like, I definitely think that's keeping me well mentally for sure, because going back to community being so essential, as much as the podcast is designed to help me tell stories with people, it's also a way for me to check in with people in a way that society and capitalism doesn't always allow us the time for. Like, you have to carve out time to connect with people. Like, one of the latest episodes that I recorded is from one of my best friends from high school, and we hadn't had a conversation longer than an hour. We haven't had a conversation like vocally in 3+ years.
Wow.
Like we'll text, we'll like respond to people's stories, but just one facet of life or another. We're not the type to just call each other on the phone, but we got to record that podcast episode. We recorded for an hour, and it's like, dang, like this was also a check-in for us. Like it was an opportunity for me to hear your voice, see you digitally, see how you're doing, share laughs that didn't even make it to the episode of the podcast, but just those little moments where it's like, oh, like I'm checking in with one of my good friends, and this feels really nice. So podcasting is definitely one thing that's kept me well. I would say physically, just being able to play basketball, like going to the gym in the mornings. I have a friend who will link up in the mornings, shoot around, play like a quick game. Like maybe it's only 30 minutes out of my day, but it's like that makes me well holistically because
Hmm.
I'm getting some type of physical activity, but also being able to connect with a friend. So I think that's kind of a theme in what's keeping me well, just finding ways to integrate connecting with people into the things that's also fueling my passions, fueling me physically, fueling me mentally. I would think those are a couple of things that keep me well.
I love that. That's dope. And always movement in the morning is always a good choice if you are physically able. All right. So what keeps you well? What's keeping you creative, inspired?
Keeping me creative and inspired, I would say it's the movies that I'm watching. I think engaging with film, also hearing people's stories, but I think film has been the thing that has been the most impactful for me because I'm a very analytical person. So especially since I've been like reading screenwriting books, watching more movies, engaging with film podcasts, I've been able to watch movies differently, like
Hmm.
really being able to like pick apart movies, seeing what messages they were trying to get and whether or not I agree with the way they try to go about giving those messages too, and just hearing the general discourse about movies. And I think the Barbie movie is a really good example of that because I think coming into Barbie, I had no expectations of it, but was also surprised of it and really loved the Barbie movie. And I think it is a movie that is divisive for a number of reasons, ignoring the division of just people's bigotry and like
Right.
anti women and anti feminism,
Yeah.
but I think that there's people who were like, oh, this is just another white feminism movie, or this is just
Mm.
another brand making a movie. And it's like, I get that part of it too, but watching the movie and accepting the flaws of it as is, like you said, it was cool to see Issa Rae in a Barbie movie as President Barbie. Like, that's just cool to see that aspect of it. And there's messages in Barbie that I feel I'm not expecting out of a Barbie movie and was pleasantly surprised to hear some of those messages for those movies. And so I think just unpacking films in that way and seeing a bunch of movies has fueled me creatively as I aim to write my own screenplay or as I aim to continue to write poetry. Because like, okay, I like how this person delivered this message. Where does this play a role in my life? How would I do this movie? If I'm looking at a superhero movie, how would I do this movie? But if the superhero is black, like how does that change the movie?
Mm.
And so I think just engaging with film in that way has definitely kept me wild. It's kept my creativity going. Um, and then, like I mentioned, the podcast. I think the podcast is a central part of just my holistic well being right now because, as you know, as a podcast host yourself, like trying to figure out how to connect the dots, see where you want the story to go,
Hmm.
making sure that you're telling a complete story and having fun with it at the same time. Like, I think that we're doing ourselves a disservice if we're not embedding fun in everything that we're doing. And recently, I posted a collage picture on Instagram of all the guests that I've had on the banquet hall. And everybody's has a
Yeah.
smile on their face, and it's like going back to those moments. Like, yeah, like even if this podcast only produced this one smile that I got to share with this person, like that's dope. Like
Yeah.
unpacking all of that. So yeah, I think that's how my creative passions are being fueled: podcasting, film, and just really engaging intellectually with everything that I'm doing.
Oh, I love that. And also, yes, I saw that graphic. It's super dope and just like fun to see the joy, especially like, I primarily listen to podcasts, so I don't often go back and like watch. But when I do, it's like, oh, yeah, it's nice to see like the face that it just changes the whole experience. And so, what a creative idea. I thought that was really, really cool. Okay. And then lastly, what is keeping you free right now? What's keeping you authentic and liberated?
What's keeping me authentic and liberated? Um, I think kind of this might get a little poetic, but
All good.
I th- I think just like the big picture of it all is keeping me like really free, like really being able to reflect on my own journey and seeing where things are connecting, how things are adding up, why different things are going the way they're going, and being a kind of similar to what I like to do on the podcast of helping people connect their own dots, like starting to connect my own dots as well. Like the movie thing, even though it's something that's been more of a passion lately, like when I really start to look back, it's like I've always been interested in movies this way. I just maybe didn't have the language to talk about it. So I think being really reflective and thinking about the big picture has been really impactful to keeping me free. I recently, as I mentioned, I recently graduated with my MBA, and I was able to give a speech at the Black graduation ceremony.
Oh.
And one of the themes that I hit on in that was this quote and this notion that I'm my ancestors' wildest dreams. And I think just thinking through that statement and seeing how often that statement shows up in my life, it's kind of impossible for that not to keep me free, because it's like, here we are creating Black content, like centering Black voices. Here I am working for this institution, making a decent salary. I'm like, we all need to get paid more, but like I'm making a decent salary.
Hmm.
Like, I'm living by myself. I'm able to support myself. I'm able to fuel my passions. I'm able to support Black businesses easily. I'm able to see visibility for a lot of Black businesses. These are things that our ancestors dreamed of and maybe couldn't even dream of. And I think just knowing that I'm living such a life that would make like my grandma proud, it'll make my great grandparents proud. Like, these are the things that keep me free. And then also, being in nature. Nature is a thing that will always keep me well, wild and free. Honestly, like, I can find creative
Yeah.
passion from nature. I can find inspiration. I can find wellness in nature. I love being by any body of water, especially the ocean. And so even if it's just a second where I get to like look at the ocean, hear the ocean, like earlier this morning, I was by the beach in La Jolla and just had the windows down in my car, just listening to the waves. Those are the things that remind me of just how big the world is and keeps me hungry to do something about it. Like, it keeps me connected with like the general scope of life. And yeah, just being in nature, taking a moment to breathe. Like, that's why I'll always shout out all my yoga friends. It's like, yeah, like, y'all raised me to be more holistic with my health. And yeah, just being in nature just really keeps me free, because it's like, okay, even if I'm struggling with, I got an email that pissed me off right now, if I could just go be outside for a second, catch some sunlight, hear some birds, see some water, it's like, okay, there's more to life than this. Even if whatever is stressing me out right now is taking up a big portion of my mental well-being, there's other ways I can find that balance and actively work towards that well-being.
Hmm. Yes. Yes to getting outside and grounding. Grounding is a well-being technique, a mindfulness technique that you can go outside and just like stand in the sun, stand in grass. If you have the chance to be barefoot, you can do that. But similar to listening to ocean waves, it's so good for our nervous systems, and a nice reminder that like there are things much greater than, like you said, that email that we have to deal with at some point. Just taking that time out to be like, I'm okay. I'm here. This moment is the only real moment. Let me take this and enjoy this. And also just how like, I don't know, sometimes I think of like the same universe in which the ocean exists, like this vast thing. I also exist. Like, how incredible is that? Like, anything is possible. Um,
Yeah.
so I think that's really compelling and important. And especially if you live near a body of water, go look at that body of water whenever you can. Just, if you live near some greenery, and if you don't, grab a house plant. If you can't, look at some really cool plants on your phone. Like, it's just something about it is really, really important for our brains, I think, because we're beings that once upon a time really spent a lot more time outside than we do these days. And it really helps regulate us. There's a lot of nature and plant medicine out there. So thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you so much for being
Of course.
here. This has been super rich, and I'm so like inspired and eager to hear other people's stories and to get back into spaces where we can have these conversations. Do you have any upcoming offerings or anything that you'd like to share with listeners?
Sure. I think but first, thank you for having me on the podcast. As I mentioned, this is my first time on this end of the microphone, so it's kind of cool to not necessarily know where the conversation's going and just going along for the ride. And yeah, it's been a joy. In terms of upcoming offerings, I think first and foremost, there's always a new episode of Banquet Hall coming up at some point. So asking the listeners if y'all can tap in with the Banquet Hall podcast. You can follow the pod on Instagram at Banquet Hall Pod. You can check out my website, thefourthkyler.square.site, and it has information about the podcast there. I think that's the biggest thing that I really want people to take away, is to engage with the people who I'm interviewing on my podcast. Like, of course, you're supporting me by listening to the podcast, but just kind of the impetus behind the podcast. Like, I want people to be organically engaging with the content. So at Banquet Hall Pod. New episodes weekly on average. Like, of course, we all got our times where episode ain't gonna come out, but on average, we're gonna have a weekly episode. You can engage with me on social media to see what's coming up next to at the Fourth Kyler. In terms of offerings and projects, I don't even know if I've said this to many people outside of like just a couple people, but I am trying to work on another poetry book. You mentioned or alluded to a little earlier that I am a poet. To date, I've published 5 poetry books, and so I just randomly got creatively inspired to work on another one. So the 6th book is coming. Can't give a date because it's not written yet, but working on it. I mentioned working on a screenplay, so that's like very future offerings, but just know I've been writing. I think that's the main offering I would like to say for the pod.
Truly, I need like a shirt or a hat that just says I've been writing, like it, because people are like, where you been at? I've been writing, like
yeah, I've been writing. That's just where we at.
Yeah, but that's awesome. I so look forward to all of the projects and, you know, following back up on the things that you've already done. Again, it's been just a joy to be the first person to host you on a podcast. So thank you for joining us, for sharing your wisdom. And everybody, yes, definitely go subscribe to the Banquet Hall podcast, give those episodes a listen, and again, engage with the guests that have been on there. Really, really, really cool folks doing really, really important work. And again, Kyler, thank you so much for being here. And to the listeners, thank you so much for listening to Well, Wild, and Free. The Well, Wild, and Free podcast is a project of Just Breathe Free Wellbeing. It is edited and produced by Eric Hamlet. To stay in touch with us, visit Well, Wild, and Free on Instagram at wellwildfree or at justbreathefree.com/podcast. For sources and information about the show, please visit our show notes.